You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
What have you got in your hand there, Phil?
I've got a bag of shredded US banknotes.
It's a bag of shredded money.
Shredded. In fact, according to there's about approximately $165 worth of money in this bag.
Which is about the size of a, I don't know, what is it, a little coffee bag?
So I went to the first International MMT conference held at the UMKC, University of Missouri, Kansas City.
Okay.
And they have a branch of the US Federal Reserve Bank in Kansas City. So we went along because they have a money museum.
Okay.
And I think we couldn't get in because we didn't have our passports with us. They wouldn't allow you in if you were a foreigner.
Oh.
But the security bloke was really nice and he handed us each a bag of money.
A souvenir?
Yeah, which they hand out to everyone who goes to the museum as they walk out. That proves that the US federal government doesn't need to collect taxes from the US citizens in order to spend because they shred banknotes, just like they in one of the early stages of modern money was in the form of tally sticks and they just burned the tally sticks when they were returned in the form of taxes.
Mm-hmm. So could you say that bag is full of tax money? Would that be correct?
No. In fact, this hasn't come back to the US federal government in the form of taxation. It's just worn notes that they just shred and they don't necessarily print new notes to replace them. It all depends on the demand for notes and coins by the US public.
So it's when you take your shoddy old note back to the bank and the bank will just take it out of their till and shred it.
And when the government spends more money, it doesn't go, oh, we're going to spend $100 million, we better print 100. They don't print any money whatsoever. How much banknotes they print depends on how much we demand our money in the form of cash.
Mm.
If we no longer wanted cash or notes and coins, we just use plastic cards or what have you, the money supply would still exist.
Mm.
But the Australian federal government had no need to print notes and mint coins anymore. That's all. I asked the security bloke, I was just intrigued when he handed this to me. I said, when you hand this stuff to most people as they exit the museum, what response do you normally get? And the response they normally get is, why do they shred this? Why don't they give this to poor people? Unshredded, of course. And of course, they don't have to. They can give $165 to poor people in this computer age with just a computer keystroke. But the thing is, they obviously think that the government's got a limited amount of money. And so when it shreds some, it's got less to hand out to poor people and to spend, when in fact it's got as much as it likes.
Mm.
That's why I can shred this stuff, because it's got as much as it likes of that stuff, usually in a electronic form and not in a paper or metal form anymore. Mm.
So behind that question, there are a lot of misunderstandings of how the monetary system really works.
Yeah.
And what was the security guard's understanding?
He didn't quite understand it either.
Mm.
He sort of concurred with everyone else that, well, yeah, why do they?
Why don't we just give it to poor people before we shred it?
I should have asked him, do you feel terrible handing out shredded money when you think, oh, we could be handing out real money to poor people?
We should infiltrate the Money Museum with an MMTer and get them working in there conducting the tour.
Yeah, there was pretty high security, I've got to say. But perhaps we could have had a little exhibit just outside of the turnstile or whatever it was.
That's what we should have, is our table that says, we don't need the shredded money, ask me why.
Yeah, why can the government do this? Why wouldn't it hand it out in unshredded form to poor people? Well, it can hand as much out as it likes.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
And Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Like, isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to another edition of Radio MMT. How are you, Anne?
Hello, Kevin. I've made it back into the studio.
We haven't seen you for a while. You've been away and you've been crook.
I've been remote.
And you've been leaving me here by myself to try and do shows. It's been.
Oh, you had the lovely Kent with you last time.
Thank goodness for that.
And I can say this with some confidence, Kevin. Hello to our lovely listeners. We have more than one listener.
Excellent, yes, because they've been helping with the Radiothon.
And I want to read out the names of our supporters because it is so heartwarming to know that there are people out there who believe just as much as we do, Kevin, in getting out the word about how the economy really works.
Excellent. Lay it on us. Who have we got?
So I want to thank Neil, John from Watsonia, Joe from Gardenvale, Lou, Anonymous from Abbotsford, Marion from Northcote, Tina from Strathmore Heights, Kent, Liz, Stefan, Ray from Brisbane, Matt from Torquay, Glenn, Anne from Warrandyte, Fred, the fantastic Fred from Cape Gloucester, and Abby from Tilden. So all of those people, they got us to our Radiothon target.
Now, my old housemate Pete, he told me yesterday that he's subscribed as well, and he said he'd even listen if I mentioned his name. So Pete, thank you. If you haven't subscribed, I will hunt you down because you're not on the list. And that means that some of the people from the podcast who listen to us as a podcast and not the radio show subscribed, and that's good. You know,
so we know both channels are working and we know you're out there.
I believe that we have met our target for this show.
We have. We reached the 950, which seemed so huge to me at the beginning, and then it just happened.
It's a small amount of money. Look, I'm going to whinge a bit here. But I'm extremely appreciative to all of the people who have donated and support the show. So we might have reached our target, but the station still needs more money to operate.
They're trying to get to 275,000. And believe me, all of that is necessary because this station takes no money from corporations. It takes almost no money from government. The only government money that comes in is for actual programming. It's not for keeping the lights on.
No, yeah.
So all of that money is what makes this a community-funded, community-operated and owned radio station, which is so rare these days.
And if you're listening to this show and you have a particular interest in macroeconomics or MMT, it takes something like 3CR to give a platform to this show. If 3CR didn't exist, this show wouldn't exist.
No.
And there'd be nothing. You'd have no way of tuning into this kind of a conversation. And so we really are appreciative that 3CR exists. They still need money. Just because we've reached our target, that doesn't mean that we're there yet. So if you're listening to this show, either live now or as a podcast, and you can just chip in.
3cr.org.au and just click the donate button.
Yeah, and as I was saying to Kent last time, money is a public utility. This is a public broadcasting station. You couldn't more appropriately place your money than putting it here.
So today, Kevin,
Yep.
Speaking of money, we are going to continue talking about money.
Excellent.
And we are going to do that with economist Phil Lawn, who is based out of Adelaide there.
We love Phil.
We do.
He's just a lovely guy.
He's great to speak with.
Like you can see, he's a genuinely gentle soul who is aware.
Yeah, we always enjoy Phil. And he's going to be telling us about how money is one of humankind's most powerful and also most dangerous inventions. And in this regard, I kind of think of money as like fire because if you think about it, humans have harnessed fire to do many life-enhancing things like cooking or forging steel. but then we also go ahead and make tanks and bombs. And money is kind of similar. Just as the way fire can be weaponized against us, money and the monetary system can be weaponized against us. So we really need to understand how our monetary system works. So in the first part of this conversation with Phil, we're going to have a look at how money emerged 5,000 years ago. You heard that right.
Yep.
5,000 years before capitalism, before markets.
Anybody in our show who's read The Graeber, 5,000 Years of Debt, will
We'll be
understand
clued in on that.
to read if you have to read.
And then, of course, money evolved from being a way for a central authority to provision itself. So that means like a king getting labourers to build him a castle or to be in his army or whatever.
Yep.
It's still a central authority provisioning itself, but it also became a medium of exchange, which is where it gets used in markets, and a store of value. So shall we have a listen to our conversation with Phil?
We absolutely shall.
3CR. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Phil Lawn back to Radio MMT. Thank you for joining us again, Phil.
Thanks for having me.
Now, just to remind ourselves, Phil, you are what I think of as a heterodox economist, which means you don't really agree with the orthodox or the neoclassical economics that is dominating how we manage the economy at the moment. And you have a lot in common with modern monetary theory, but you do put your own spin on it, which I really enjoy. And that happened in a presentation you gave recently to Economic Reform Australia, a group over there in Adelaide.
Yeah.
And in that presentation, you made quite the claim, which is that you said that modern money is perhaps one of humankind's greatest inventions. So how do you justify that claim?
Well, prior to modern money, when it came to public goods, there was a time when they really weren't provided in the quantities that people wanted. Public goods generally consist in the form of just riches and monuments for emperors. And the way resources were acquired by the emperor was through tyranny. But with modern money, it could be acquired through the volition of the masses. And it was done by imposing a tax liability that was only extinguishable in the currency that the emperor spent into existence, which created a demand for that money. In other words, paying people to work for the emperor or buying things off the masses.
That's not very modern though, Phil. That sounds like ancient.
It is. If you read David Graeber's book, it's called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, essentially the money that we use today is much the same as the money, this modern money, that emerged 5,000 years ago.
So what do you mean by modern?
It's whatever exists in the past that still exists in essentially the same form today.
So we've had these modern money systems for 5,000 years.
That's when modern money emerged. There's still examples of what we might call pre-modern money. And with pre-modern money, it was just a way of recording debts. They were just, you owe me something.
What I've heard of is that there was a system kind of known as Wehrgeld. So, for example, if I poked out your eye, Phil, I might owe you a cow. But if I, say, killed your son, I might owe you 10 pigs and a cow. And so these were debts.
Yes. So when you owed certain people various things, it was usually as a form of punishment.
Okay. And so what made modern money modern then?
They weren't used as a medium of exchange. So people didn't say, oh, this person owes me a pig. I can use this to purchase something else off someone else. They weren't used in that way. So it was just a unit of account. So a unit of account is just one of the features of modern money. It was the only feature, function of pre-modern money.
So what we're saying is that money kind of evolved.
Yes. Of all the features of modern money, the only one pre-modern money had, even if it wasn't perfect, was a unit of account. It certainly wasn't a medium of exchange. It wasn't a store of nominal exchange value. Yeah, it wasn't money as it exists today. Money as it exists today first emerged about 5,000 years ago.
So for it to become modern, to become a means of exchange. Then
one of the things that probably happened is that the emperor, the currency issuer, spent more into existence than they destroyed through taxation. So you didn't have to supply your labour to the emperor. Someone had this currency left over, so you could in fact work for that person. And that's where modern money would have become a medium of exchange.
so it's so important to understand that they were spending in more than they were taxing back, and that difference.
Well, at some stage they would have, yeah. And how much the government has to tax to quell the inflationary effect of its own spending depends on how much the private sector wants to save. The more we save, the less it has to tax us. Because the thing that causes the inflationary pressure is not just the government spending, it's the combined spending of the private sector and the public sector. So if we're saving more, the private sector is spending less. So in other words, our saving is playing the role of taxation.
Right. It's like self-taxing.
Bit differently because taxation destroys our spending forever, whereas saving just means that we're delaying the spending. We can spend it later on.
It's kind of a temporary self-tax.
And the main benefits of it, this modern money today, was the reason why it emerged in the first place. That is for the currency issuer to efficiently and effectively have real resources transferred from what we now call the private sector to the public sector, so that the currency issuer can provide public goods to us all that we all desire, such as schools and hospitals. And remember, it's not just modern money, it's taxation. Taxation emerged alongside modern money. Taxation was required to drive the demand for the currency. You had to acquire the currency to pay your taxes. And if you didn't pay your taxes, you lost your head. In the pre-modern era, resources were transferred from the so-called private sector to the public sector, but you required a huge army of people to manage the enslaved population. Those resources were transferred through tyranny. And that was very inefficient because you needed a huge army, and they were generally the most able people that were being wasted. They weren't being used to build things. They were just being used to manage people.
You needed people who were stronger than the slaves to keep the slaves in check, and that resource could have been far better utilised. Yep.
That's right.
So is this why you're saying money is one of humankind's greatest inventions?
That's one of the reasons, yes. It's a really effective way to get schools. Now, money doesn't provide a school. You need the resources, but it's a way for the government to obtain the resources to provide schools, hospitals, universities, roads.
So you replace the slaves with the taxation system, is what you're saying?
Yeah, with willing people who willingly supply their labour. So you know how people think that the government has to raise money before it spends? The reason why people think that's the case and don't realise governments, in fact, just tax to create a demand for the currency is because once it became a medium of exchange, then markets evolved and they thought everyone acquired stuff through spending. They had to find the money first. So over a long period of time, once modern money became a medium of exchange, people lost sight of the fact that modern money was first created by government.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
Once we got from pre-modern money to modern money, what you're looking at is the power of modern money.
Yes. So this wasn't one of the original intentions of modern money, but it became an important function and was quite beneficial to us all. Once we could save in the aggregate, so long as the government was running deficits, it meant we could delay spending. So we could work hard when we were young, spend less than we earn, save money, so when we get older and we don't want to work anymore, we can keep spending. We spend our savings.
Or like my kids go on overseas trips. They'll save up for a few years and they'll take off for a few months and they'll defer their spending earlier on to save up for a later time. So it's this time shifting of their spending ability.
But what about buying a house? It can take 30, 40 years to save the money to buy the house. By the time you've saved up enough money and you've bought the house, you might be on your deathbed. So instead of saving up for 40 years to buy a house and then buying a house the day before you die, you buy the house now, all right, because you have to borrow money, and then the money that you save over the next 40 years you use to pay off the loan.
Uh-huh. And so now what you're talking about is what? Being able to take our future spending capacity and bring it into the present.
That's right. So it allows spending to be brought forward. So then became the other important time machine aspect of modern money, and that was having financial institutions create credit money and advance. I don't call it loans because loans connotes the idea that something is given to you that belongs to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when financial institutions create credit money, that is new money. They don't lend depositors funds. So I call them advances. So you advance money.
And this is a kind of very important point, because the orthodox line is that banks lend out their deposits.
Yeah, that's garbage.
And so it's regarded as a loan. But as we well know, that's not the case. Banks create new money when they give somebody credit. They
advance it, yeah.
All they're asking from the person is, can you pay back the numbers that we're going to put in front of you?
That's it.
And so they're not actually lending money that they already have.
No. So loans create deposits, not deposits are required to create loans.
They will lend out new money, and when it's returned, it's cancelled out. So it's not actually taking something that's in existence and giving it to somebody else. It's creating something out of thin air and then having it return and dissipate.
Yeah, when the bank loans credit money, it goes into the economy, and then as the person pays back the principal, it's destroyed. So that money comes into existence, then is destroyed.
Right. And I really like the reframing that you're doing with the different language there, Phil, because it's using words like loans that can easily misguide us.
Well, it does. So is it any wonder people think that banks lend depositors funds when they're called loans?
And so saving and borrowing is only possible with this modern money that we now have.
So for the currency users in the aggregate, to save, so that doesn't mean every individual is doing this, but in the aggregate, if currency users are saving, it means they're spending less than they're earning. But one of the things we know is that income is equal to what is spent. Okay, if what we earn is what we spend, how can we spend less than what we earn? So it's impossible for us to earn more than what, in the aggregate, than what we spend in order to save. Well, it is possible, but it's only possible by having the currency issuer spend into existence more money than they destroy through taxation. So when we save, that is, spend less than we earn, the private sector runs a surplus, but it's only made possible by the government running the deficit, spending more than they tax. So when you learn that the private sector surplus is equal to the public sector's deficit, it's true, but in fact, that surplus, the private sector surplus, is only possible because of the deficit. Once banking emerged, because then banks could create so-called credit money. That's when you could have more money being spent and circulating within the economy that was being destroyed through taxation.
So the next great leap forward was to have these banks become part of the monetary system as well.
Yes. People don't realise that banks, whilst they've had a so-called licence to create credit money, it's always been on the condition that the bank convert the credit money to the currency issuer's base money when required. So, for example, if you get a bill for $1,000 and you've got no money in your account, and you think, well, I've got to pay this and I don't get paid till after this bill is due, I'm going to have to borrow the $1,000. You go to a bank and the bank advances you $1,000. It'll put $1,000 into your account. Now the bank has created this credit money. When you say, bank, could you now transfer this money, so to speak, it's not really transferred, it's destroyed, in fact. What you are asking the bank to do, you don't know it, you're saying, could you please convert this credit money to base money? And the bank has to do it. Now, the bank It may already have excess base money in its reserve account, which in Australia are called exchange settlement accounts. If they don't have it, they've got to get hold of it for the payment system to work. They either borrow it from another financial institution which has got excess base money.
Mm-hmm.
If there was no excess base money in the banking system for a bank to borrow, they can always borrow it from the Reserve Bank.
So the more you save will affect the dynamics of the economy that you're in. Can you expand on that at all?
Well, that's very important because when the private sector is saving, the financial system is far more stable. So if there is a shock to the economy and people's income is affected negatively in some way, they can draw on their savings. Which means, of course, if the private sector should be running surpluses for the financial system to be stable, it means the government's got to be running deficits the majority of the time.
Yes.
When the private sector is running deficits, it means that it's borrowing. And what behavioural economists and psychologists have found is that when our income falls, we don't just reduce our spending, at least in the short run. What we tend to do is we tend to maintain our spending levels at something we're accustomed to. Because they're accustomed to a certain level of spending, but their income's fallen, they have to borrow. And so private sector household debt goes up. So you normally see household debt as a percentage of household income rise prior to a recession. And then, of course, the private sector has to accept lower spending levels. It just can't keep borrowing. It's got to pay back that debt. And that's when private sector spending collapses. And that's where you get your recession. And of course, we see a lot of bankruptcies, and that leads to other sorts of issues within the financial system.
There's a bit to unpack in that, Anne. It kind of got me a bit confused when he was talking about the income equals what is spent. And I thought, income equals what does that mean? Because surely if you earn an income and you don't spend it all, then there's going to be savings involved in there. But how I understand that is that income equals what is spent. You can't have an income unless somebody else has spent.
Yes.
So how do you measure what's been spent? Well, you measure how much income has been derived in a particular time.
Yeah, there's a way of looking at it. I was thinking, say I have $10 in my pocket and I go to a cafe and I buy a coffee for $10. That $10, from my point of view, that was spending, but from the cafe's point of view, that was income. And it's the same $10. So that's why they say when you add up the whole economy's income and you add up the whole economy's spending, that's why these macroeconomists that are looking at the macro economy will say, well, income has to equal spending.
Yeah,
but
but. And it says, how can we spend less than what we earn? Well, you'd say, well, we spend less than what we earn. That's how we save. Where we're trying to get with this is, where does savings come from? So again, you have to keep in mind the public sector and the private sector, the currency users and the currency issuers.
Yes.
So this is the sort of the
great conundrum.
The great conundrum is, right, how can we spend less than what we earn? Income equals what is spent. Spending has to equal income, and yet people save. So how does this occur?
And the only way it can occur is through government deficits. The currency issuer spending, because the currency issuer doesn't have to save. In fact, the Australian federal government can't save. The only way they can deal with money is they're either creating it when they spend or they're destroying it when they tax. So the federal government is not doing any saving, but it can spend more than it's taxing.
It appears that it's saving, but that's because we keep on applying the private sector dynamics to the government sector.
Use the wrong language
incorrectly. That's misinformation. When the government receives tax, it doesn't save it up. It destroys it. It cancels it out. So it creates currency and it cancels it out. We save and we spend, but the government creates and destroys. It's a different dynamic.
That's right. So I was thinking, like, one way to look at this total dynamic of this earning and this spending and this saving is to say that the struggle between workers and capitalists is basically, it's over who gets hold of this extra money, who gets hold of this deficit in the economy. And in fact, I even heard Cameron Murray say on his podcast recently, his podcast is called Fresh Economic Thinking, that all politics is essentially a debate about who gets this surplus of money.
Who gets what and why, Anne,
Yes.
is how you so
Exactly.
aptly put it in the intro.
That's right.
There was one thing which he said which interested me. He said that it's good for the private sector to save because it smooths out the bumps. If people have savings and there are disruptions to the economy, then it's good for them to have savings. But it did occur to me that if you had a very government-centric economy, a government that provided for its population, it's a rare thing in today's world, but I've just been studying Cuba and there are other places as well, is that where a government is more socialist, then there's less need for savings because
That's right.
your ass is covered.
That's right. If we had proper retirement benefits, for example, you wouldn't need superannuation.
Yeah, you wouldn't need to privatise your retirement, because the
that's right.
government, if you were comfortable that the government was going to look after it, you'd be fine.
Yeah. So those are some important points there. It's understanding how these economists, they've divided the whole economy up into the private sector, which is businesses and households, and then the government sector, which includes the currency issuer. And once you divide it up that way, you get a much better idea of what's going on. And you also see that who has debt means very different things. So like Phil was saying, the private sector debt is the one to worry about, not the public sector debt. So the mainstream economists have got it completely back to front. And Kevin, guess what country has one of the highest rates of private sector debt in the world?
Well, I know that
You're standing in it.
I know that we did because of the Costello years, because of all of those government surpluses. Government surplus equals private sector
Australia's
deficit.
up there in the top 3 of highest private sector debt. So they make your economy more fragile. You're more likely to throw your economy into a recession.
And we have private sector debt because of our incredibly high housing prices,
That's right.
predominantly.
That's
Because
right.
our houses are so expensive as a proportion of the annual income, there's no way known that you could raise that money. You have to borrow larger amounts. And I was reading just today about a legacy problem that is going to rear its ugly head in 20 or 30 years' time, because now they're saying that people are going to be paying off their houses well into their retirement. Another large proportion is still going to be renting into their retirement, which means that security into retirement is going to evaporate in a couple of decades' time.
And we know the government can step in and probably will have to at some point. The other thing that Phil was talking about was this ability with money to go time travelling.
Time shift, yeah. And this is the benefit of the modern money system.
That's right. So if you're saving, then what you're effectively doing is bringing the past into the present. You're bringing your past spending ability into the present. And if you're borrowing, you're bringing your future spending ability into the present. So that's one of the powerful aspects of money, and why we don't want to get rid of it. One of the things about who gets to enjoy the surplus, who gets to claim some of that deficit, is about who gets to have economic rents. Economic rents are a way of drawing more of that surplus to yourself unfairly. And that's what we'll be talking to Phil about in the next segment. But before that,
We're going to have a song. We're going to play some music, Anne, because it's Friday, and Friday's a lovely day. So anyway, this is an anti-love song by Betty Davis that I heard during the week. I know very little about it other than I liked it.
No, I don't want to love you, 'cause I know how you are. That's why I've been staying away from you. That's why I haven't called you, 'cause I know you could possess my body. I know you could make me scrawl. I know you could have me shaking. I know you could have me climbing walls. That's why I don't want to love you. Cause I know how you are. Sure, you say you're right on and you're righteous, but with me I know you'd be right off. 'Cause you know I could possess your body too, don't you? You know I could make you crawl. And just as hard as I'd fall for you, boy, well, you know you'd fall for me harder. That's why I don't want to love you. 'Cause I know what you do to my heart. You scorch it just like a hot iron. Leave me burning alone in the dark. 'Cause I know you could make me suffer. I know you could drive me mad. I know you just take me in a circle. And when it got real, I know you disappear. That's why I ain't gonna love you. 'Cause I know you like to be in charge. And with me, well, you know you couldn't control it, don't you? 'Cause you know I'd make you drop your guard. 'Cause I'd have you eating your ego. I'd make you pocket your pride. And just as hard as I'd be loving you, boy, well, you know you'd be loving me harder. That's why I don't want to love you.
You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
and wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us.
Before the midro, we heard from Betty Davis with her song Anti Love Song. Good song, but we're going to continue our conversation with Phil Lawn.
Something that we actually haven't talked about on Radio MMT yet is this 4-letter word that economists use. That 4-letter word is real, the real economy. And before I became interested in this economics, when I heard the economists talking about the real economy, I thought it was just some kind of verbal tick that economists have, because of course the economy is real. It's not just a fantasy. Although, of course, Margaret Thatcher told us that society isn't real, but I think she was in an Ayn Rand fairyland there. So can you tell me, what do economists mean by the real economy, and what other kind of economy could there be?
Okay, so the real economy is the physical economy. So there's natural resources transformed by labour and capital to produce real goods and services. That's the real economy. It's the real stuff.
It's the real stuff.
Yeah, we can feel, we can touch, we can smell, we can taste. The financial side of the economy is more abstract. Okay, there are notes and coins, but the great majority of money in this computer age just exists as numbers in cyberspace. on computer hard drives and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the financial side of the economy. That's having enormous impacts on the real economy because resources are mobilised by spending. So we're talking real resources within the real economy are being mobilised and being pushed here, there and everywhere by spending, which is financed by what's going on within the financial economy.
I see. So the idea is that once you have monetary systems, then you get all these kind of negative aspects of a monetary system, all these, you might call them unintended consequences.
That's right, because you don't want to get rid of modern money. A modern, complex, sophisticated economy cannot exist without modern money. So we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You don't get rid of modern money because the modern economy can't get by without modern money and it can't get by without modern markets. But they need to be properly regulated. And to do that, you have to understand the desirable and undesirable features of both modern money and modern markets. And most people, and even economists, politicians, bureaucrats, don't really understand why these modern money and modern markets exist, how they came into existence, the desirable features of them, which we should exploit, and the undesirable features which we should quell and can only be really quelled by government.
You did go through a number of those negatives in your talk, including economic rents, unemployment, inequalities, externalities, financial instability, and so on. And I guess as an activist around modern money, one of the main things that I would advocate is a stronger hand from the government to counter all these negative side effects of modern money. So I'm just wondering if you would agree, Phil, that the federal government is the only entity that has the capacity to put in those guardrails?
No, they're not the only, and state governments can introduce some of that.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to the issuing of the currency and spending into existence to ensure we deal with some of the undesirable features of modern money, one of the main ones being unemployment, that is something that only a currency issuing central government in Australia, the Australian federal government, can really deal with.
So the financial economy, could we say that's effectively the monetary system?
We could also say it's all these designer financial assets.
Mm-hmm.
One of the wonderful things of modern money is you can save, you can delay spending, but there's a thing eating away at your savings. It's called inflation.
Mm.
So you like to think that you can at least maintain the spending power of your savings over time. Well, designer financial assets were created as another means of maintaining the spending power of your savings, but it's gone further than that. Now it's a way, in fact, of increasing your financial claims on stuff being produced in the real economy without doing anything.
Mm.
See, asset markets, it's great when prices are going up. And if it's a piece of paper going up in price, that can lead to all sorts of problems when the price of those pieces of paper, I'm talking about the designer financial assets, crash. That can create problems for the real economy because what it does to spending.
Is it inevitable that a financial collapse has to lead to problems in the real economy? Is that why we have to worry about it?
Well, history shows that eventually these assets get bidded up to ridiculous levels. You think about it, you buy an asset and it goes up in value over 10 years. The only way you can obtain the benefit, realise the benefit of the increase in its price, is you have to sell it. You've got to sell. Well, if enough people start selling, then you can get a run downwards with the value. And that's when, with a bit of herd behaviour, you can get crashes in the prices. And a lot of people borrow money.
Why does it matter if the value of those bits of paper collapses? Like, I don't understand why it should affect the average person, being able to feed, clothe and house themselves.
Well, because the average person is buying these assets. It's called superannuation. Because one day you want to sell the thing and you need a buyer. So, of course, when there is a collapse of the stock market, who usually suffers? It's the superannuants. There you are, you've got $400,000 in your superannuation account. There's a collapse on the stock market and 6 months later your $400,000 is worth $300,000. But the people playing the game, they didn't lose. They made the gains by selling it to the superannuants who aren't playing the game. Someone's playing the game on their behalf. That's whoever the superannuation company is.
I don't get why we're worried about superannuation, because we can always afford to pay pensions. So why do we care if we wipe out that wealth?
Well, we used to have a good superannuation scheme. Yeah, it was called the old age pension, when the pension was actually worth something.
Another clear example of this was the GFC, where you had the property prices in the US collapse, and in the end, people couldn't afford to pay back their loans. Their house is now worth less than what they bought it for. There's an economic collapse. Did the government come in and look after the property owners? No. It left people homeless. Did the US government come and bail out the banks? Yes.
Oh, I see.
I'm not against superannuation, but it shouldn't be compulsory. So if people want to put money to the side, saving is an important thing. It's one of these wonderful things about modern money as a spending time machine. But the way in which money is saved is important. And as long as it's going into productive assets, that's fine. But it's not. It's going into pieces of paper. It's going into property.
What's happening now with all these financial designer products you're talking about,
Yes.
if they increase somebody's wealth, increase the numbers in their account, that can quite often be at the expense of somebody else, because there's nothing real being produced for that transaction other than a transfer.
That's right.
That creates winners and losers.
Well, if someone's financial claim on real wealth increases without producing any of the real wealth, it must mean that someone else's financial claim on real wealth, usually someone who's creating the real wealth, is less than what they're creating. So there's a winner. Someone's gained a claim on the stuff that really matters. Financial assets only have exchange value. They don't have any use value. You had $1 billion put in your bank account and you never spent it to the day you died. Well, it was pointless. You're not better off, because you have to spend the money to get the stuff, the real stuff that does have use value.
This is Bill Mitchell. You're listening to my favourite Melbourne radio station, 3CR, with Anne and Kev. Great program, great guests.
So, going back to problems that are peculiar to monetary systems, one of the great scourges of modern economies is this phenomenon known as economic rents.
Right.
And of course, when I first heard this phrase, I just thought we were talking about, the money that I pay to a landlord to keep a roof over my head. But now I'm starting to understand that this issue of economic rents, I think of it now maybe as one of the great debates in the history of economic thought. And we're still having this debate over economic rents or rentier income. Mm-hmm. So can you explain what economic rents are and why they are so important to understand?
I mentioned something that was sort of an example of economic rent earlier when I talked about these designer financial assets, where you can buy a financial asset and then you sell it later on at an inflated price. You've increased your claim on real wealth. You haven't produced any real wealth. That's a form of economic rent. The monetary value of your financial assets going up faster than inflation, or at least at the same rate as inflation. You mentioned, when you rent a house, you pay rent. That's not what economists refer to as economic rent. So rent, the classical economists, they started to classify the way the various factors of production were paid. So it was labour got paid wages, capital got paid interest, and land got paid rent. And that word sort of stuck. So economic rent, let's say you own a resource, a real resource. So you have to mine it, extract it from the ground, and supply it in the market and sell it. And usually you want to earn a little bit of profit as well. So there might be a level of profit that you're satisfied with, and that's enough to induce you to extract the resource and sell it. Mm-hmm. You're not going to extract it if it's going to cost you so much, and then the price that you receive for selling it is less than what it's cost you to extract it. Well, we can call that the minimum supply price. It's the price the resource has to be to induce the resource owner to extract it from the ground and supply it in the market. Let's say you need to receive $10 for a tonne of a particular resource in order to cover your costs and earn a little bit of profit. And once it reaches $10, you'll supply it. Mm-hmm. But you receive $30. So you earn above the minimum required to supply that resource. That difference, that $20 difference, is an economic rent.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do sell at $30, you've now received a payment, which now is a financial claim on real wealth, which exceeds the resource that you're extracting and supplying in the market.
Mm.
So you've increased your claim on real wealth simply by being able to sell the resource at a price above the minimum supply price. And that's only made possible if someone else within the economy is receiving a payment for what they're supplying. It might be their labour, less than the real wealth that they're helping to generate.
That's the part I don't understand, why those two things are linked, because why can't we have people receiving more than what they're really earning, and then the other people also?
Well, because what we earn is what is spent, remember? Spending equals income. And when we spend, we're buying real stuff. So if someone's receiving more when they supply real stuff than the minimum supply price, someone must be getting a payment that is less than the value of the real stuff that they're helping to create, because that stuff's going to the person who's earning the economic rent.
You'd call these distortions, that they're distortions in the market.
They are. And Henry George showed that you can confiscate through taxation the economic rent without it distorting factor markets. So, for example, the person who was willing to supply the resource at $10 but receives $30, let's say we tax that $20 away. Will they keep supplying the resource? Yes.
Yeah.
Because they'll still receive the minimum supply price. So it won't stop them supplying the resources.
So that's the solution.
So you can use taxation to smooth out these distortions.
Confiscate economic rents.
Yeah, because these economic rents usually end up with somebody having more power and influence than they should have, which undermines the democratic process.
It can do that, but it also distorts the way people invest. So what happens is, if there are areas where you can earn economic rents, investment goes into very unproductive areas.
And other areas get neglected.
Yes.
When we were talking about inequality, and we were talking about those different channels via which inequality is exacerbated, including the rentier income.
Well, economic rents is a huge area where you get inequalities.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the great fortunes of the world. So this is one of the downsides of modern money. You can now become a billionaire by playing golf. And that is important, because most people focus on the distribution of income, and that is different.
Right.
So it's how much we get paid when we work, but no one becomes a billionaire working. In general, you become a billionaire dealing in these asset markets. There's the odd industrialist who actually becomes a billionaire producing something useful, but the great majority of billionaires today make their billions not producing a single bit of real wealth. Nothing in that real economy that we talked about. It's all just shuffling assets in the financial economy.
I've had people say to me, well, what does it matter if we have billionaires in the economy? Can't we just live and let live? And yet I think there is a connection between the fact that some people don't have enough and billionaires have way too much.
No one has produced $1 billion worth of real wealth. So when you've got $1 billion of assets, you can use that to acquire real wealth, the useful stuff. If they can financially claim $1 billion worth, it means that they've managed to accumulate financial claims on real wealth that far exceeds the real wealth they've generated themselves, which means someone else or other people within the real economy, their financial claims are much lower than the real wealth that they're generating. Once upon a time, some of the wealthiest people, you might say they were too wealthy. Your Henry Fords and your Rockefellers became too wealthy, that it wasn't fair what their financial claims on real wealth were, but at least their increase in financial claims on real wealth approximated the addition to real wealth that they were helping to generate. They were producing real useful stuff.
You're talking about industrial capitalism.
Yes, industrialists made fortunes, but at least they were producing useful stuff.
There was something to show for the dollars. They might have too many dollars, but there was something to show for it. Now we're talking about financial capitalism,
Yes.
where we're just seeing the numbers increase, but without any product attached to it.
And the people who are worse off, well, we've seen that with real wages, even in wealthy countries. But the real losers are the people in sweatshops in the third world. We just shifted production in the Western world away from the West. We get these vassals in the third world to do it at ridiculously low wages.
Yeah.
The other sufferers to some extent of that are future generations as we deplete natural resources and, of course, other species. Only 2% of the mammals on Earth are wild animals. The rest are either human beings or our livestock.
Yeah, so there's two ways we could say the person who's managed to have a couple of Learjets and their island with their castle with their bunker in it in case of the end times, and their cruise ship can come and go and all of that, they are actually connected in a very real way with the millions of people who are living in slums or the future generations.
That's right. They've been able to claim this stuff, pay for it, but they haven't produced an equivalent value of real wealth that they've sold to get the $1 billion to acquire the yacht, the island, the Learjet and so forth. Billionaires is a problem because their claims on real stuff do not reflect the real stuff, the value of the real stuff they produce, which means it's coming at other people's expense.
So I think we can't really take a live and let live attitude to billionaires.
No.
And there were some really astounding statistics on what happened during the COVID lockdowns when the government was spending all this extra money into the economy via the job seeker and the job keeper. At the same time, we saw a bunch of Australia's billionaires. Somehow they were coming out of the lockdowns with extra billions of dollars. How does that happen?
So the government went heavily into deficit. Remember, the government's deficit is our surplus, which is savings. A lot of that went to wealthy people.
Why?
So when this money is saved, the deficit of the government becomes savings. A lot of economic models, and it's not just mainstream economists, heterodox economists just assume that it either sits in a bank account not earning interest, or if we're not satisfied with that, if we want to earn a bit of interest, we buy a bond. So your alternatives with your savings in a lot of these macroeconomic models are your savings sits in a bank account not earning interest, or you buy a bond. And it's not just sitting there passively either in a bank account or as a bond. It circulates. And as it circulates, it's being used to buy and sell assets, and it's pushing up the price of assets. And that's where billionaires make their money.
I see.
So it's all these designer financial assets and other durable assets. So it could be a painting by Picasso you buy now and then you sell in 10 years and you make a fortune. You could buy gold bullion, wheat, commodity markets, a house, so property markets, shares, you could buy bonds, corporate bonds, you can buy this and that. And then your financial assets increase and then you inject it to buy the real stuff and your claims on that real stuff increase.
Right.
But you haven't helped increase the size of the real economy.
3CR. I think I finally get what's going on with these billionaires, Kevin.
Yeah.
So monetary systems, they create the possibility for us to save money, and we want people to save because that's what gives stability to the economy. And so what we did was we gave people with savings ways to protect those savings from inflation. But the problem was these protections, like getting a bit of interest, have mutated into what Phil's calling these designer financial products. So now they're not just maintaining the value of their savings, they're actually growing their savings exponentially. And so these wealthy people, the more wealth they get, the more they can influence the law to find more ways to grow their wealth even more. So it's like this vicious cycle.
As soon as there's government spending, like there was during COVID, anybody who is selling stuff is figuring out how they can get their hands on it. And that's where, when you've got a conservative government like we had at the time, they geared those payments to go as directly as they could into the hands of the uber rich.
Well, they went directly into our hands first. So JobKeeper and JobSeeker went to the working people.
So that we could pay our rents.
And
buy stuff, so that we could buy from Harvey Norman and keep Harvey Norman rich.
And then Harvey Norman is using that to buy assets.
Yes.
These designer financial assets.
Yeah, so because government deficits equals private sector surplus.
That's right. So these economic rents are basically channels for sucking all that extra money straight up to the top.
Yep.
And I've got some numbers here because I was mentioning in that segment about how the billionaires did really well out of the pandemic lockdown spending.
Yep.
And Australia's billionaires increased their total wealth by 34% during the 2020 crisis, and 3 mining magnates doubled their wealth during the pandemic. So Gina Rinehart's personal wealth went from 16 billion to 36 billion. Andrew Forrest's wealth went from 13 billion to 30 billion, and Clive Palmer went from 4.5 to 10 billion. Anthony Pratt, he ended up with $21 billion extra, and Kerry Stokes ended up with 7.2. So you can imagine where all that JobKeeper, JobSeeker spending, which was around, I think, 130 billion, you can see where all of that went. It went straight into the pockets of these people.
Now, these people weren't there with a shovel in their hand digging the ground furiously and earning all that money. This is the point.
They weren't our necessary workers, were they?
No.
So there was a January 2022 Oxfam report which said that Australia's 47 billionaires, I didn't know we had that many, we've got 47 billionaires. They've got more wealth than the bottom 7.7 million Australians.
Yeah, well, you're kind of getting used to hearing this. But
I know, these numbers are astronomical. And in 2021, we created 390,000 more millionaires. So now we've got, how many millionaires would you say we'd have in Australia?
How many millionaires? I don't know.
2.18 million.
Millionaires.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting to talk to Phil and understand what the real economy is compared to the financial economy, because people often get the two mixed up when they're talking about the collapse of the economy. And then it's also good to understand the difference between this bloated, parasitic financial system compared to the monetary system. And it's like Phil says, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to eradicate economic rents and get rid of that, but we want to keep the monetary system.
And I think a large part of this bloating comes from just the misconception of what money is, and we have to constantly remind ourselves money is an invention, and it is utilised by government to provision itself and its society.
That's right.
And the extra trade that goes on beyond that, that's kind of like that's an extra. But what we've done over the last 30, 40 years in particular, the trade part of it, so people can trade and exchange, that's now become the focus. And the whole government part has been pushed into the background. And so all the focus is on the trade and how much of this money you can get your hands on,
yes,
without fully recognising how it distorts the environment or the whole world that we live in. And this is where we're talking before about winners and losers, is that everybody who's rich in the global north has acquired their wealth predominantly starting off with slavery, but now it's the global south providing all of the materials and labour, etc., at ridiculously cheap prices to make these people uber rich.
Right. So this is how monetary systems get weaponized against us, and it's via these designer financial products and via the privatized part of the monetary system through the banks and so on.
Can I read something from Castro, because I'm reading this book about Castro at the moment.
Kevin's got a book in front of him.
And hearing this interview, and then I'm reading Castro at the same time.
Okay.
So this is from an interview with Federico Merzgoza, former UNESCO Director General, January the 24th, 2000. So 25 years ago.
Okay.
Just a little section here. The developed capitalist system, which later gave rise to modern imperialism, has now imposed a neoliberal and globalised order that is simply unsustainable. It has created a world of speculation in which fictitious wealth and stocks have been created that have nothing to do with actual production. It has created enormous personal fortunes, some of which exceed the gross domestic product of dozens of poor countries. This is not to mention the plunder and squander of the world's natural resources or the miserable lives of billions of people. There is nothing this system can offer humanity. It can only lead to its own self-destruction and perhaps along with it the destruction of the natural conditions that sustain human life on this planet.
That's very prescient, isn't it?
I love, and
They could see
that's
it
25
coming.
years ago. Yeah.
The Marxists could all see this coming. And that's because the financial economy affects the real economy, because money is all about what they call mobilizing resources. So if you get your billions of unearned income, you've now got access to billions of dollars worth of stuff that you shouldn't really have access to.
A lot of it we don't need. The capitalist model says that we've just got to make stuff so that people can sell stuff so that somebody can make profit. And I reckon half of every dollar I spend these days goes towards stuff that I don't need, that isn't necessary, and its main purpose is to make somebody who's already ridiculously rich even richer. You know, I'm just guessing. Half of the economy.
If you're part of the economy, Kevin, you are sort of inevitably drawn into the web.
Yeah.
So, you know, we don't want to get rid of money. And I found an example recently of what it looks like when you suddenly don't have money. And there's been a couple of cases this year where payment systems have been hacked. And there was one in America, this company called Change Healthcare, which operates the payment system between doctors and insurance companies. And it processes 1.5 trillion, with a T, dollars of claims per year. It was hacked. It went down. And what happened then was that scores of healthcare clinics had to stop work because they couldn't pay their staff, they couldn't buy their medical supplies, which meant scores of people went without healthcare. And that was only a payment system going down. That wasn't even a currency going down.
That's how we're held ransom to the system that we're in. We're beholden to it.
So in this episode, we had a look at 3 of the undesirable aspects of modern money, which was financial instability, economic rents, and inequality with these billionaires. And all of these are given life via these designer financial products. And when you think about it, I mean, what's a financial product? It is simply a contract, which is a rule, a set of rules or agreements that says who gets to increase their savings and how. So in our next episode, Kevin, we will return to our conversation with Phil. And we're going to look at more about how these economic rents distort investment. And of course, one of the big distortions at the moment is the housing bubble.
Yes.
And what's going on in the housing crisis.
Don't get me started, Anne.
No, well, I'll get you started next week, and I know you'll have something to say. And we'll also look at the other negative consequence, which is unemployment.
Till then, excellent. We're heading off to the Union Club Hotel for our monthly catch-up with MMTers. Come along, but we do it once a month. But till next time, we've got Vicky coming up next with Mafalda. We'll see you again in a couple of weeks' time. See you, Anne.
See you then, Kevin. You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime, wherever you get your podcasts, or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, no, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the permanent income hypothesis, or the Ricardian equivalence, or rational
I
expectations.
think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them, and we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get